Welcome to the video version of Sprout Lab's webinar on how to make your e-learning more interactive. I practice what I preach. Our webinars are fairly interactive, so we don't actually record the live sessions. We have a fair bit of interaction happening, and I've actually got some of the slides on the whiteboard from the live webinar to actually share with you today, because this particular webinar had some really great participation. Also, thank you if you're listening to this and you're one of the people who reached out and responded to my message about what did you want from this webinar. That really helped to shape some of the things I focused on during this particular session. Short introduction to me. I'm Robin Pettart. I'm the founder of Sprout Labs and a principal consultant with Learned. Sprout Labs builds digital learning platforms that enables you and your team to deliver and author and measure high-impact learning ecosystems. The two main systems we work with is Glasshouse, which is a next-generation e-learning authoring system and delivery system, and Tatara Learn. In actual fact, many of the things I'm talking about and some of the examples I'm showing today are built in Glasshouse. And some of the things, if you sit there and go, oh, I can't do that in our platform, these are things we can do in Glasshouse. The other side of what I do is work with Learned, which is with Jeevan Joshi and David Haggerty, which is a learning consultancy business where we really focus on learning ecosystem design and how that can be used to build customer-centric and cost-effective learning solutions. During this video version of the webinar, we're going to look at three things: how interactive scenarios and stories can be used in e-learning, what e-learning can learn from game design beyond the normal standard gamification things of scores, levels, and leaderboards. We're going to dip quickly into how the 70-20-20-10 model can be used to expand your e-learning beyond just courses. Now, that's actually something I've done full whole webinars on. It's actually something I found that as I was doing the prep work for this, I didn't actually have as much time to go into as what I would like to. So that might be a topic for further webinars during 2018. Now, before the session, I sent messages to about half the people who'd signed up, asking them what they wanted from the particular session. And what really came back as a strong message was people wanted ideas and tips about how to make learning more engaging. And they talked about how, and essentially a lot of their learning was large chunks of content that wasn't engaging, that was just had a quiz at the end. So I thought I'd start and started the webinar with a session that was really interactive around what is and isn't engaging. Now, what was really interesting was essentially the sense that people were really distracted. They weren't focused when they were not engaged, and they weren't learning either, because essentially learning's difficult. Learning is actually something that involves lots of change. Now, these are particularly screen grabs from the actual session, so these screen grabs are a little bit actually blurry, so I apologize, and I suspect by the time they've got the video quality, they're not going to be great either. Then when someone's engaged, it's completely different. They're curious, they're asking questions, they're participating, and they're retaining what they're learning. They're actually alive, and they're really starting to participate. Now, one of the things is, and one of the things that one of our instructional designers talked about after a particular workshop, someone sat there and said, oh, we want to make our learning sessions more engaging and more fun. And we drilled into this, and what they wanted to do was make them more entertaining. And we sort of picked this apart. When you think about it, that these things on the right-hand side are not so much about entertaining. They're about when people are focused on what they're doing. And in workplaces, people don't always need to be entertained, but they do need to be engaged. And quite often what they find the most engaging is things that are actually valuable to help them do their job better. One of the main reasons that so much e-learning is not engaging, it just focuses on quite often knowledge and awareness as the outcome for the courses. And this is one of the core problems with e-learning, is it's essentially quite often just an information dump. At the same time, we need to be careful that interactivity is not used just for novelty. It's actually driven to help people ask good questions, be curious, and be really engaged, and really helping them make those changes. There was a moment in a design workshop one day where we were working with a group of stakeholders, and one of the stakeholders talked about wanting their learning to be more entertaining. Now, we actually talked about this as a group, the instructional designers and learning designers that were there afterwards, about this word entertaining. And we sort of pulled it apart a little bit, and we sat there and went, well, in actual fact, the role of learning isn't to be entertaining. Yes, people are quite often more engaged if they're entertained, but engagement is really about being in a spot where you're making sure people are really getting new activities and new learnings and new behaviors that are helping them do their job better. So it's really important to make sure that interactivity is not just used to drive novelty. It's actually used to build active learning, to make people active participants, to be able to practice and think through what they're doing. So this is a map of the design thinking process that Sprout Labs uses to redesign and rethink how organizations do learning. Quite often at the beginning of this is a really deep stage of developing an understanding of the business problem, who the learners are, and what the possibilities are. What this really quite often means to move away from this sort of knowledge and awareness objectives means really rethinking what the purpose of the course is. Now, this actually sometimes takes a very subtle level of influencing skills as well to be able to help people move from that spot of training and learning just being about knowledge pushing out. Now, we're going to follow through in this particular recording a little bit of a case study from Glenn. He's an L&D consultant at a telecommunications company. And essentially, the case study and the situation is the legal team has decided that everyone that's involved in the digital transformation programs needs to do a course on managing customer privacy. Now, I actually opened up to the group at this particular moment about what questions Glenn could be asking his stakeholders about what they were doing and what needed to happen to actually sort of help move it forward a little bit beyond that whole knowledge and awareness situation. So there was some great participation in this particular session, like just the basics of instructional design, who's the audience, like the basics of instructional design, who's the audience, what do they need to do differently, and what mistakes people are making. In fact, this is a really good example of a really powerful set of questions here, and it's one reason why I was really keen on sharing the actual slides in this particular thing. Also thinking about the future, and it's one of the classic questions if you engage and work with Sprout Labs, you'll hear me ask quite often, what does this look like in 3 years' time if we're sitting together? What does success look like? Also putting metrics and targets on things that really quickly makes sure and means you have to rapidly move away from a knowledge and awareness. We find in the beginning of a project, if you start to talk about attaching business metrics and key KPIs to learning programs, it really changes and shifts the conversation. So quite often it makes people realize what's needed is more than just a learning solution. It needs a sort of full, more holistic capability solution. So this particular questions around metrics can open up quite different possibilities and very different and new ways of engaging with people as well. Now, some of those fantastic questions people were asking during that analysis and understanding phase of instructional design leads to this slide, which I'm not the first person to actually talk about this whole idea of focusing on what people need to do instead of what they need to know. It was actually moved forward a lot by Kathy Moore and has been taken up by a lot of other people as well. It's actually interesting because it's a very simple concept. It's quite hard to sometimes actually get to the spot to implement. So once you focus on what people need to do, this then leads to the interactions in your learning experience. So essentially what your learning experience becomes, instead of a piece of knowledge, it becomes a series of situations where people can practice what they need to do. And that's where it's sort of interesting, because essentially the whole core of interactive design and e-learning is a simple concept that if you focus on the decisions, choices, and situations that people need to be in and need to make, you can then build up something that's quite powerful and quite interactive. That's very, very different to a lot of the types of e-learning we see now. Some really useful verbs for helping move beyond knowledge are things like apply and follow, which are very similar to knowledge, but way more active. Participate, find, and examine. I mean, imagine a e-learning course that's about finding is actually a very different and might have a more of an exploratory interface than one that's around apply and work through a specific set of procedures. And then a build would be really more interactive as well, because you'd be sitting there rethinking and thinking about ways that people could actually affect things and control things, and leads to a very different way of thinking. These are deliberately being sort of organised loosely around Bloom's taxonomy as well. I now want to just do a bit of a background on games and interactivity in games to then lead on into what e-learning can learn from game design and stories in games. This is a continuum of interactivity of digital experiences that somewhere along the line, I think I developed or stole from someone a long time ago, and it sort of morphed over time. So if you ever see something that's very similar, I do apologise. I'm not quite sure where the original reference is. So most of the time we spend on time online is reading or watching video, quite passive. Then we might have some quizzes. Then games become more interactive. Then in actual fact, I've slotted these sort of notions of sharing and discussing, which is actually interacting between others and with others as being a higher order level of interactivity. And then multi-user games is actually at that sort of level of that collaborating with others and working with others. Now, as we're diving into this sort of discussion around games, I'm not a gamer. I actually became really interested in game-based learning when I saw my son almost disappear into multi-user games over a summer holiday break. At the same time, I saw him learning, setting goals, working through things, working in a team, being in social situations. And it was actually interesting because I sat there and started to sort of think, well, why is he so engaged? What's it doing? So that also then led to some thinking around, well, actually, what is engagement in games? At the first level, and the first thing people do actually start to engage with is the gameplay. What you're doing in the game, the twitch, and that's the first thing people engage with. And there's actually just some games that actually have nothing much more other than that are casual games that really just like the side-scrolling games that you might find on lots of mobile phone games. And then the next level of engagement is around game mechanics, which is quite often scores, levels, and leaderboards. And we've all heard this word gamification, which is really about applying these types of game mechanics to particular situations and quite often in workplaces as well. It's interesting because people quite often work and feel quite comfortably with working with scores and the notion that as people develop expertise, they go up levels. But to be honest, outside of sales, I haven't really seen people engage in leaderboards really well outside of sales. Then the next reason someone keeps on playing and engaging in a game is the story. And then further beyond that is a story that they become involved with when they're collaborating with their peers and working with other players as well. So it's this sort of thing that, in actual fact, the things that move people forward in terms of time and engagement is actually these higher things around story and collaboration. Now we're going to keep on working through and exploring what story in games means as well. So essentially, stories in games is built as people move around a game world. They move from one level to another level. They unlock something that builds new narratives. There might even be a film-like sequence in between that sort of gives them the background for what they're doing. So essentially, meaning is built in a game world as the world is navigated. It was a while back, I did some workshops with some game writers, and this was one of the things and one of the strong messages they made was that you almost, rather than organising a narrative around time, you organize it around time, and then actually how someone's allowed to move around the levels and the map of a space. So essentially, as they unlock different spots, that unlocks and opens up new parts of the story. So don't build a course, build a story world instead. And what I mean by a story world is actually going to become a little bit more understandable in the next few moments. Now, you might notice me use the words scenario, case-based learning, and stories, all sort of interchangeable. I don't take a very academic approach on this particular thing. I think they all sort of reflects a realistic situation, and that's essentially what I'm talking about here. Rather than sort of arguing about what's the difference between a story and what's the difference between a scenario, one of the main reasons to use the word scenarios is they're seen as being sort of more serious. Now, to drop back to games, narrative in games is built by three things: the characters, people who are there, what their background story are, where they're located, and then the rules that are governing those worlds as well. I just talked a little bit about that sort of notion of moving from one spot to another spot and unlocking something, and that's driven by essentially a set of rules, if then that style statements. Now, in scenario design for learning, this gets transformed into a little bit of a different situation. You have the context down the bottom, which is sort of your characters in your location. Then your actual choices is actually what people are doing, what their performance is, where they're going, what they need to do, who they're doing it with. So a few questions to ask around this to help open up what your context might be. Where is something happening? Who's involved? What's happening? And then what might they be feeling? Then the actual performance analysis questions. Now, these series of questions are fascinating because they literally lead to the choices in a multiple choice questions. What's the actions? What's the consequences? The consequences become the feedback. The preferred option becomes the correct answer. Notice I'm using the word preferred as well. Quite often in learning resources, we can actually work, and Glasshouse works in a way where we can actually sort of score things and show things as being sort of partially right. So it doesn't have to be this sort of black and white, incorrect and correct. So you can have this sort of sense of greyness, which is actually more common in the world. And then the barriers can actually also help to build up some of the backstory behind that particular scenario and particular question. Now, to show one of these sort of story worlds in action, I'm going to talk about a resource quickly, which is about developing health literacy skills in health workers. It was for about an audience of about 15,000 people, so it was incredibly diverse. And what we did was we built a fictional town that you'll see a map of in a moment. We put a series of characters that were having struggles with the health system in that town, and then allowed people to be able to explore that. So this is the main map that someone actually had as their main set of interface. They were able to move around this in any order. The numbers were there as triggers to suggest the possible order that they go through. If they clicked on the number 8, what they would get is this type of screen. Get a little bit of a explanation, quite small. Sometimes these were actually video as well. The whole learning experience had this guide for each one of the scenarios. These were particularly designed to be really short descriptions and short explanations. Then the learner clicks through to the challenge. They get essentially a very short background of trying to explain it in a visual way as well, what's happening. Then they go into a multiple choice question, which is something like this, about how they would respond. Now, another sort of exploratory interface for a resource that was designed for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health education for doctors in training and their supervisors. So essentially this was organised around a clinic, and people could navigate through each one of these doors and go through the scenarios there. So sort of one of the important things with this, and this is part of that link to that notion that narratives built by exploring a space, is that people are allowed to move around. So the lockstep forward, backwards buttons are gone. If you remember back to the beginning when someone talked about someone being engaged, they're curious. You can't be curious if you're locked into a into a series to do everything the same way. So just doing subtle things like freeing up the navigation allows people to be able to have more freedom and possibly become more curious. Now, at this moment, I opened up to the group to have some ideas about what could be features of Glenn's story world. Some really nice ideas here, core things like real examples, branching scenarios, consequences of not following and doing the right things. Also, this sort of exploring and seeing the scenario from different sides as well was a really nice one. And someone brought this whole idea up of metering good and bad privacy decisions as well. So adding a little bit of a scoring mechanism to to the learning experience as well. And then just breaking up the navigation so it becomes more interesting than just a forward linear thing. So often when people think about scenarios in e-learning, they think about complex branching scenarios, the choose your own adventure style scenarios. So to go back to that notion of moving around a space, this is how narrative is being built in games. In actual fact, choose your own adventure books were the best-selling books in the 80s. I'm still to find a generation of people or a group of people that don't know what I mean when I talk about choose your own adventure books, because even if weren't published in the 90s, they're still around people's houses. People are giving them to their children to read, even if they're not being published. So it's a really sort of fascinating spot where, in actual fact, this is quite often what people think about with scenarios. But there is actually a few other different ways that you can actually work with scenarios as well. In actual fact, the patterns that's most quite often used in computer games is not that complicated branching situation. It's quite linear. You move from one spot, you might have a story sequence in between, you move to another spot, and it's actually working through all on the same quest that all gets the same outcome. The classic one that happens is a very complicated branching, which is actually, I promise you, quite a lot easier said than done to design. And in a few moments, I'm going to introduce a framework that I think makes things a little bit easier for this as well. Now, quite often when we go into a situation where we're working to design a branching scenario, we're thinking it's going to be something like this. What we actually end up with SMEs is something that's more like this, which is, I think of it as being more state-based. You essentially have a series of choices that you need to make that then drives you through to the next state. And everyone ends up in that same state before they then make the next set of things. So it's a nice way of being able to have a balance between this type of linear situation and giving a lot more choice and interactivity, but still not having the complexity of all of these different options. Now, a framework that's very similar to some of the ways Kathy Moore talks about some of the branching scenarios is this idea of stems, that you actually have a stem and a set of scenarios that an average person would do, ones that would be bad and ones that are good. And then at each decision point, which is through here, there's a spot where people can move from the good to the average, or if they'd ended up starting to go down the bad pathway, they can actually then move back up to the good one as well. What's nice about this is it makes it more controllable. You can actually, and less chaotic than what I was talking about with that thing going everywhere. You sit there and say, well, what are the key decisions that need to be made? What are the steps? What are the average performance for this? What would be the good? What would be the bad? And then you start to weave them together. And that can work extremely well as a nice framework for being able to structure these branching scenarios in a way where they don't become chaotic and don't end up with so many different options and so many different graphics that you actually make them unbuildable. Now, you might be hinting and hearing me sit there and say at this particular moment lots about choices. Branching scenarios are really just multiple choice questions with the consequences shown. So you do something in a branching scenario, and then your actual outcome is another choice. Multiple choice questions are our building blocks, and they're possibly the unloved or sometimes even overloved thing in e-learning. Quite often, when we're working with subject matter experts, they sit there and go, "Oh, can we put another type of activity in here?" And that's that novelty thing revealing its head again. It's not actually happening for any good reason, for an instructional design reason or a engagement reason. It's just because someone's sort of sitting there going, "Oh, we've done too much of the same." That whole notion of making sure that what you're working with is an engagement that actually has real meaning. Now, a few different ways scenarios and multiple choices can be used in scenarios is mapped out in this table. Now, one of the risks with actual scenario-based e-learning is it's very quick and easy to dive straight into interactive scenarios. But sometimes people need to be shown the whole big picture, how things work together. And this is where a scenario story can be used as a way of explaining how something needs to work. Now, at that first stage, quite often people's reaction is to make sure that's just one big linear thing. It can be one linear thing, but you can actually build questions and multiple choice questions in that are asking people to observe what's happening during that scenario, to label those things. Then as they've got that sort of sense of that overall how things actually work together, then you can start to work with the interactive scenarios. And in this sort of spot, there's probably two main patterns. The first person, almost a role play like situation. What would you do in this situation? Now, this is great. Personalize it. It's more likely to lead to a higher level of understanding. But at the same time, if you've got a course that needs to appeal to lots of people, then you need to make the scenarios, make sure that they're relevant for everyone's particular job role, which is one thing that's very challenging around this first person situation. Now, another one that's actually a higher order skill is actually asking someone to give advice about that. So, what would your advice be to Jack as the character that's in a particular scenario if Jack was one of the characters? Now, this is interesting because it means that people don't actually have to feel like that particular scenario is exactly relevant to their job role. So you get a little bit more flexibility. It depersonalizes it a little bit. So you can sometimes actually, with this third person approach, do more confronting types of interactions as well that are a little bit more risky as well. So don't forget about that third one, which is actually that third person viewpoint of being able to sort of look at something rather than actually being in that first person spot. Now, as people develop more expertise, scenarios can be used to trigger people's planning about what they might do afterwards, reflect on what might have been in the scenario, or reflect after they've been doing things as well in the workplace. So this is where quite often in that 70-20-10 model, people forget about the fact that people need to go off and do things after courses. And in actual fact, digital learning can be used to drag people back into doing things like reflection and planning activities as well. It's not just about that first acquisition of knowledge. It can help scaffold people's actual reflective and planning activities for change as well. Now, being given all the details is boring. One thing you can do to make things a whole lot more interactive rather than giving everyone everything, and then part of the unfortunate reality is that sometimes the only way that people can actually access the knowledge in their organisation is through e-learning and through the training programs because it's not documented elsewhere. And probably what should actually be happening is rather than developing an e-learning course is the actual practice needs to be documented, made searchable and made easy to access rather than actually building an e-learning course. So one of the things you can do is to actually get people to find the information and resources. And this is what they're going to need to do in their workplace. So there's a few different ways of combining interactivity and information and content together. This is our classic one we see in most e-learning, information dump with a quiz at the end. It's actually modelled on a lot of the ways that people have learnt in the past. You've gone along to a series of lectures and then you've done a test at the end. And assessment at the end is really common. It's needed sometimes, but there actually are other ways of building interactions in as well. Now, the most common pattern, and probably the easiest one, is actually mixing the content and the activities together. Now, this is actually the one I used for the webinar, which was actually to have some content and then you've seen some activities mixed in with that. Now, this is quite easy to do. In actual fact, I quite often, even when I'm working on a learning experience, sit there and go, so I've been given this information, I'm going to have a challenge that every 3 sections of content has to be an activity. What's really interesting is sometimes you can actually build up more than every 3, or even say when I was doing the prep work for this webinar, to be honest, I did map out the content first. I did have some ideas about some of the interactions and where they were going to go and what they needed to focus on. But essentially the bulk of what I was doing was mapping out the content and then weaving the interactions in around it. Now, another way of combining content and activities together is this pattern where it's driven by activities. So someone goes into a learning experience, it starts with a question. Then, if they're not actually able to answer the question, there might be a button that shows some information that they can then use to answer the question. So definitely multiple choice questions are not being just then used in this situation for quizzing. They're being used for putting people in a spot where they're making decisions. Sometimes this information can be actually in the feedback. Instructional designers quite often talk about the notion that they really sometimes want people to get the interactions wrong, because in some ways the best learning experience and the best explanations of things are actually in the feedback on the questions that are wrong or partially wrong. Now, sometimes this actual thing down through here, and I've called it a media-rich book, might be a series of videos that people can access as well. And I've seen different types of learner behavior here, where some people who sit there and go, actually, I do want to access all the content to start with before I go through and do the more active learning experience. So it also, particularly with these types of learning experiences, it frees up the learner to be able to explore and to be curious and have more control over their learning experience as well. Now, I opened this bit up to a interaction at this particular stage during the webinar, because there's some real pros and cons to this approach. Yes, it makes it more interesting and gives people ownership, but then there's some possibilities, and a couple of people talked about it, that maybe people just get the right answer because it's a lucky guess rather than actually really thinking about it. Also takes a whole lot more effort, means stakeholders really needing to be engaged with the approach as well. And there's quite often a risk factor with stakeholders where they're sitting there going, oh, we need everyone to go through all this content, and then the programs become so huge by the time you build interactions and activities that cover all the content, that becomes unreasonable in terms of the scale and scope of it for the learners to engage with. Because essentially there's sometimes moments in the content that needs to be there that are smaller things that don't actually build pure interactions. So just even as I am thinking this through, and this is actually not something I talked about in the webinar, there's probably actually a hybrid between those two patterns is actually possibly the most practical, where you do have spots where you have content activity, but then you also weave together content that's driven from the activity that people have to look up. Now, back to Glenn's scenario. Also, as part of the digital transformation project, there needs to be a new customer management system. Many people talked about the challenges that they were having when I sent out an email message about what people were interested in, why they were interested in this particular webinar, about the challenges of making software training engaging, and also challenges of making software engaging effective. Now, the challenge with most software training is it focuses on the features, not how to achieve the results with the software. It's a classic, what do people need to do? So instead, what you actually have is what is descriptions of what the features are. Now, this is maybe also because as software evolves, new features come out, and people need to communicate. I'm not going to use the training word about actually how those new features are used, and then this actual process of training people around achieving the result is actually considerably more complicated. It involves a sort of a bit more of a holistic way of thinking, and I think about it as almost a hierarchy of approaches as well. That quite often when you go into software training, it's really focused on either help or the how-tos. But actually, at the beginning, people need to understand the concepts. And then they might need to have examples of how those work to be able to then understand those concepts as well. Then once they've got those examples, they need to be in a spot where they need to be able to see how that's done. Then as well as seeing how it's done, they actually need help and reference material as well. And unfortunately, in actual fact, a lot of software training is probably more in this spot where it's actually help and reference. I think a really powerful way of being able to work with software training is thinking about a performance support approach. If you've never heard of the performance support approach, and particularly Bob Mosler's 5 distinct moments of need for performance support, it's a really fantastic framework. This notion of people need particular types of learning experiences when they're new, when they want to dive in and understand more, then when they apply, and then also they need to be supported to solve problems. But there's also another layer as well about change, which is actually also very similar to what's new. So in actual fact, in terms of software training, when it's new, people need to know how to achieve activities and achieve their job roles in the software scenarios. When they want to do more, they might actually only need examples of actually how to do more complicated things. They don't actually need the full scenarios. But when they want to apply something, they want something that's searchable. They want examples, the job aids, they want the reference, and they want the help. This is also what they want when they want to be able to solve problems as well. It's really interesting. Quite often people talk about the notion that e-learning means that people can look things up afterwards. I don't think I've ever seen any research that shows that anyone looks up anything in e-learning modules. And then to trap all your software training into SCORM objects and not make it sort of searchable, then makes it very hard when people come to this apply spot to then just need just-in-time things. And then back when it's actually the change moment, when you're back into this spot where especially if it's a big change, it needs to be back to scenarios as well. Now, just a bit on the 70-20-10 learning model. And if you haven't heard about it before, it's this notion, an idea that 70% of what we learn is from experience, doing our job roles. 20% is from others, and quite often, especially your direct line manager. And then 10% is learned from formal learning courses. Now, to put a bit of a digital learning frame across this, and one of our instructional designers talks about one of the really big things that the 70-20-10 model can bring to e-learning is thinking about the fact that in actual fact you can make your e-learning more experiential based and more like a real job task as the first step in a 10. But essentially there's some things around social interactions that you can add. Quite often people think straight about discussions and Yammer and Facebook style things, but there's some really other simple things you can do as well. Things like social interactions around polls, simple commenting in short answers where someone might be asked a question, and then after they sit there and have that response, they can see what everyone else's responses are. And these are, if you're sitting there going, I can't do that in my own e-learning authoring tool, I'm partly talking about these things because these are some of the things we can do in Glasshouse when it's running in cloud mode. And you're actually using it for delivery as well. The other thing that I will explore in some future webinars, and might even do some webinars that are 100% content free, is where in actual fact this whole learning experience is social, and then build some social interactions and discussions between people online. Now, There's also some things that can happen in terms of designing the 70-20-10 model. You can get people to do things like go back out, do interviews, mirror people, be involved in mentoring, and then share those things back to people as well. And one of the things is being able to use the sort of features that allow you to be able to build, sometimes the same features that are in learning management systems to remind managers that their people aren't doing courses can be used to tell managers, well, someone's just finished this course. Now you might want to talk to them about such and such, or ask them what they thought about this scenario, or this might be a good time for them to sit in on someone else doing such and such task at this particular moment. So essentially you help support and scaffold that 20 as well. Now, a few bonus slides I didn't actually get to talk about in the webinar. Few just other ideas to throw out there. Just simple things that can actually be really good ways of making your learning experiences more interactive. Start with a quiz. This is a great way if people think they know what they're talking about. Make it hard so that they all of a sudden go, actually, I didn't realize that. Start with a self-assessment, so it's more reflective. Put it in shorter sections, which is part of the whole micro-learning trend. And then also adding post-learning activities as well. Now, a few people came back to me when I asked what they needed was they wanted to be able to think about how to make compliance training more engaging. I suppose the first thing is just making it smaller, making it things that are sent over time, so essentially it doesn't become a chunk of things that people have to do every year. It's smaller bits. Smaller bits also means that each year you can actually change them as well. One of the really big trends we're seeing is that compliance trainings are they integrated into programs that really are around communicating people's organizational values. So essentially an onboarding program that might have, and an organization that might have values around working well with others, actually goes across equity as well. Also, compliance training is sometimes now being used to embed those messages about values as well. So it becomes a chance to actually go beyond the core compliance and core legislation to sit there and go, well, this is actually how we want you to behave in these types of situations. Now, on that topic of behaviour, there's also this other thing that's happening in compliance, and I think of it as beyond compliance. Someone cares about these things. It's a legislative requirement because of certain reasons. And sometimes if it's something like safety, it's actually because it's putting you as an employee at risk if you're not working in a safe way. So essentially rethinking the training so it focuses on the reasons why a certain behaviour is really important at a personal level. Thank you for listening to this particular video that's based on the webinar content. Each week I try to spend a few hours with people who've been to some of our webinars, talking to them about what they're doing with digital learning, seeing if there's some insights I can bring, or there's some way we can help you improve your digital learning technologies, or some of your other approaches, and maybe even some strategy work through Learn It as well. So if you're watching this, you probably have my contact information. Just send me a message and we can set up a time to have a chat if you're interested.